All right. Very good morning once again to everybody. Did do an excellent job, Elliot. Great job. I call him brother. He's not our brother yet. He is still a young man, but I have a bad habit of doing that sometimes. I talk to everybody, so many people, that I just call everybody brother these days, it seems like. Why not? All right, so this is a new quarter. We're starting a new quarter of studies here in the auditorium. And this past quarter, we studied missions with our missionary, Scott, and learned several things about indigenous missions, and it was great to be able to see him and the capable teacher that he is. And today, of course, is a big day as we send off Scott and Rebecca as a congregation to send them off into the mission field. We're excited about that. But with this new quarter, we're going to return to our previous study of the life of Christ. And in this particular segment, or quarter I should say, we're going to focus on one specific aspect of the life of Christ, and that is that of parables. I never did give the back part of this. So somebody, could you run this upstairs for me and give that to him? If you could advance the slide for me, he's going to bring up this clicker back for you. We're going to be focusing on the parables of Jesus, the parables. So as we move through, as we have done over the last year in these study and chronological study of the life of Jesus, we're taking all the different events of Jesus' life and putting them in a chronological order. And so what we'll do a lot of times is we'll have an event that will be, say, in Matthew, but there'll be a parallel account of that in Mark and Luke and sometimes even John, or sometimes it will only be in John. And that's what we do as we move through this chronological account and look at these different events in the life of Christ. All right, now we've got, so here, for example, you might have seen this in the back of your Bibles. If not, I have a copy of this. It's available on download on our website. But it is this list of these different events in chronological order. And as you can see there, the four accounts of the Gospels, and sometimes it's in all four, sometimes it's just in one. And this is where we're at now, is the life of the parables. If you were to take and look at Jesus' life in just a line, just a chronological line, you start there on the left, and you can see there's just a few events. I know you can't read that. If I were to zoom in, you see simply the birth of Jesus, Mary visits, the Magi visit Jesus, up to whenever he's a young man. So not a whole lot of information do we have in the beginning of Jesus' life, but then whenever you get into the gospel accounts here, it takes this 3 to 4 year period of his ministry, and then there's all kinds of events. And so if you were to put each one of the events in the various years of his ministry, then we are approximately right here, where Jesus teaches the kingdom parables. And so as we're progressing through his life, we get now to this point of the parables, and that's where I want to bring you up to in this particular case. Now, if you want to, open your Bibles to Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. Brother Rick, do you have that passage? Okay, so if we're tracking along in this chronological order of the story of the account of Jesus' ministry, we get to this passage here, and it's paralleled in Matthew chapter 13, which we're going to look at, and also in Luke chapter 5. But it says here that he again began to teach by the sea a great multitude, and he talks to them in parables. Now, before I proceed any further, because what's about to happen is something that I believe that you've already seen. How many of you like to watch series of shows, like TV shows, or even the movies or something like that on Netflix or on TV, but you watch a series? Have you ever done this where you watch a series up until this season ending, the season finale, and then it's a whole maybe 2, 3, 4 months before you get the next one comes on? Andrea and I, what we typically do is, hey, there's a new episode of such and such on. Let's watch this. And Andrea almost always say, well, let's watch the last one so we can catch up with where we're at on the new one. So I see a lot of head shaking. So we're not the only ones that do that. Well, we're about to do that also here with our study because of something that I've actually already taught several months ago. Whenever we got to this point, we talked about parables. And so I want to back up just a little bit and just refresh your memory. Take just a few minutes to refresh your memory about parables. Some of you might remember that I put this picture up. When it says here that he began to teach by the sea, and a great multitude gathered around him, and he got into a boat and pushed offshore and was teaching them. Well, we know where this place is, or we have a good idea where this place is, because of this cove that is there along the Sea of Galilee. Do y'all remember us talking about this a few months ago? All right, good. So, all right, that means it's sticking. So just bring you back up to speed to where we were with that. So we have a good idea where this takes place, and the reason why it's important to understand these things is what he's teaching. When he says he's teaching thousands of people. But the most interesting thing that we need to understand is what is going on, what it is he's teaching. It says he began teaching them in parables. The word parable is to place beside or to compare together. It comes from two Greek words that were translated into a link beside something, and basically what it means is using an earthly or a physical object to explain heavenly spiritual concepts. That's what Jesus is doing. He's going to take normal everyday things and apply them in a spiritual matter so that we can understand what heaven is like and what the kingdom is like and the spiritual things. So whenever Jesus would teach, he would actually, literally point to something. For example, in Mark chapter 4 here, and also in Matthew chapter 13, the same thing, the first parable we're going to look at, the parable of the sower. He could have been standing right there in an area where people would see exactly what he's talking about. So he would point down and he would say, some of the seed fell on the path. There would be a path right there. Some of the seed fell in the thorns, and there would be thorns right there. Some of the seed fell in the rocky places, pointing to that. And then, of course, some of the seed fell on good soil. These are things that all disciples would certainly understand and be able to appreciate and be able to grasp what it is he's talking about. But then there's some more things that we need to understand about parables, and that is that he uses these parables not only of elements that people would recognize, but even wording and things like that. These metaphors. Whenever he would say, for example, a master, when a servant went to his master, or the father, or a king, most people would understand already what he's talking about because the rabbis would use these same terminology, same terms to teach similar things. And so that's why we say stock rabbinic metaphors that he was using. So whenever he would talk about masters, fathers, or kings, he's meaning God. He's talking about the Father. And then when he talks about servants or children, he's meaning us, God's people. In this case, Israel, God's people. And things like harvest would mean judgment, feast would mean this banquet of the saved. So he uses, again, these metaphors, this terminology to help us understand these heavenly concepts. Now, real quickly, you can classify the parables into different types. So whenever he would tell a parable, there were certain types that he would tell, and the most that he told were the kingdom parables. So how many of you have ever been to heaven? Nobody. Okay, well, how do we know what heaven looks like? It's hard for us humans to understand this spiritual concept, and so the only way you can do it is explain it in human terms. And that's what he would do. That's why we have the sower and the tares and the mustard seed. He's just giving you little glimpses of what it is. It's the same thing. We used this analogy before. If you were to go into the jungle and contact some tribe who's had no other outside human contact in centuries, and walk up to them and say, hey, I want to show you my phone, or let's say you don't have that and you're telling them about a phone. Well, how would you describe this to somebody who's never seen it? And doesn't even know what a phone is, much less video, maybe even glass. So you got to start with things that they know. Well, we got this thing that we communicate on. It's like, and you'd probably pick up a rock or something, a shiny rock. It's kind of like this. And it actually transmits from this rock to that rock. And they're going to look at you like you're crazy. What do you mean, rocks transmitting to rocks? And you talking to a rock. It makes no sense. That is exactly what Jesus is doing with us. He's trying to explain to us what heaven is like, but he might as well be saying it's like picking up a rock and it's communicating to another rock. It's hard for us to really grasp. In fact, you go to Revelation chapter 4 and 5, you get a glimpse. John, the apostle, got a glimpse in a vision of what heaven looks like, and you see this throne. But notice every single word is, it's like this. It was like this, or it appeared to be, because he couldn't use the exact words to try to explain to us what it's going to be like. It is so magnificent, so wonderful, we can't, as the phrase says, wrap our heads around it. So we have to come back down to our level and try to explain it a little bit in basic terms. And that's where the parables come from. So you have the kingdom parables, then you also have parables about stewardship. These are principles in spirituality and the faith that we adhere to. Service parables like the Good Samaritan, the preparation of being ready for the judgment day. So you can classify them in different ways. And then even the Jews, when they write, would take these parables and put them all in chapters. Well, they didn't really have chapters, but they would group them together. Now, it doesn't mean, for example, that Jesus taught the parable of the sower, the parable of the tares, and the leaven all at one time. It's like we get to this point in Jesus' life, and all of a sudden he just starts spewing out all these parables because, hey, it's in chapter 13 of Matthew. That's not how it works. The Hebrews would take themes. They group things together by themes. And so if Jesus spoke a parable in the early part of his ministry, and a parable in the middle, and a parable at the end of his ministry, they would just take all three of those, as they did in Matthew, and just group them together. And that's why we have these groupings of parables. So you have them in Matthew 13, Matthew 25, Mark chapter 4, Luke 15, and so forth. Now, what's interesting, and I love this, is a lot of our songs are based off of parables. We sing many songs that are straight from the parables of Jesus Christ. You know, the thing about parables is they're easy to remember because they use these objects that help us remember easier than if you try quoting a verse from the Bible versus quoting a parable. Usually you can get most of the parable. Same way with songs. We remember songs. And so things like bringing in the sheaves, God is calling the prodigal, I am the vine. Even our children's songs like the wise man built his house upon the rock. I think everybody in this room could probably sing that right now. And so the songs that come from these parables serve the same purpose as what the parable does, to help us remember these things. Now, here's some important points, what I really want to remind you of before we get into this, the first parable here of the seed and the sower. These are not children's stories. We need to remember that because Jesus is talking about serious things here. He's talking about judgment. He's talking about you getting to heaven and what heaven is like, and you need to be there. And so these are not fables. They're not riddles or anything like that. They are real stories. They're intended to communicate through some type of narrative form. A parable has a story or a plot to it. It has a beginning and an ending. Now, there are some shorter parables like the mustard seed. Those are more like similitudes, which is a different type, but they're the same thing, is they have a story or a plot. And they always refer to things that are real, not imaginary. They should say imaginary, not imagery. It is imagery, but it points to it points to things that are real, not imaginary. Facts and experiences associated with human life. These are things that you can relate to, never transgressing the limits of probability. So in other words, that's going a little bit, for example, whenever he gives the metaphor of taking the log out of your eye before you get a speck out of somebody else's eye, that's a metaphor, and that's not probable. That's not really going to happen. You're not going to see that. That's not what parables are. Parables are, they stay within the limits of probability. These are things that can happen. Jesus told stories true to life to make life more clear to truth. See what we're talking about with picking up a rock and talking in it? He's trying to use these to help it make more sense to us. All right? They also have a universal appeal. They allude to things that everybody understands: agriculture, domestic, family life, trees and fruit. And he always puts them in a point that people would be able to identify. All right? For example, I'm going to pick on you a second, Rick Martin. If he were to say, the kingdom of heaven is like a man building tables, would that get your attention? If you don't know, Rick's building a bunch of tables for an upcoming special event. And that would get your attention. But is he the only one who's built a table? I've built a table, and there's other people in this room, I'm sure, who have or understand it. But he uses things that people will be able to identify with and pulls the person in. It employs drama, discernible scenes, presented concisely and simply. This is the beautiful thing about a parable. There's no misunderstanding. It gets right to the point. You can understand it for those who understand it. Only one plot is developed. The stress comes at the end, and the subject matter is taken from everyday experiences. Now, there are some purposes of prophecy that I want to get into real quick, and that is to fulfill prophecy. Go ahead and open your Bibles to Matthew chapter 13. We're going to be looking at this, the parable of the sower. But before we do that, let's understand a couple of things. Matthew 13, 34 and 35. After you read about the parable of the sower, the first one that comes across here, it says, all these things Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables. Without a parable, he did not speak to them, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things which I have kept secret from the foundation of the world. This is part of the reason why Jesus spoke in parables. Not only to teach us about the kingdom, to teach us about these spiritual concepts, but also to fulfill prophecy, to show that he is the Messiah. Jesus fulfilled over 300 prophecies, and this would be one of them, that he spoke in parables. In Mark 4:33, if you want to keep your finger here, we're going to come back to Matthew 13. We go back real quick to Mark. In Mark chapter 4, verse 33, it says, and with many such parables he spoke the word to them as they were able to hear it. We're going to talk about this some more, but there's basically two functions, going now back to Matthew 13. You see here, to reveal and to conceal. To reveal and to conceal. Look in Matthew 13, verse 11. And the disciples came and said, why do you speak to them in parables? Verse 11, he answered and said to them, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. So this revealing and concealing at the same time. Teaching part of the crowd, but the other part is not going to really understand it. It's almost as if he's just speaking in another language. It revealed truth to those who were responsive. If you're seeking the truth, you would find it through these parables. It served as a vehicle through which a person might demonstrate his heart's true intentions. Kind of like a spiritual litmus test or a responsiveness to the character of a person. But those who resisted the authority refused to grasp the implications. So Jesus could be talking about, for example, this parable of the sower. There's going to be people in the audience who are listening to every word he says, and they understand the words that he's using, but they don't understand the meaning. They don't get it. Have you ever done that? Have you ever listened to somebody and you understand they're speaking English, but they're saying things that you have no idea what they just said? $26 words. That, or maybe just a different way. Have you ever talked to an Australian? You know, they have a whole different way of saying things. You know, I throw it in the boot, and we'll go down. You know, you're saying, what? Throw it in the where? And they use the same words. You understand those words, but they use them differently than we do. That's kind of how these parables would sound to the Pharisees and people like that who were not seeking truth. just sound like a bunch of garbly-gook. But to those who understood, as he says, it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. So if you had the ears to hear, in other words, you didn't just hear the words, you were listening to the words and able to grasp what's being said. All right, so those who really want it would gain access, and then how parables function. The points of reference are the details that the hearer identifies in such a fashion he sees himself in the story. Like a minute ago when I said, there was a man who's building tables. Immediately, Rick Martin's going to say, oh, I identify with that, and it draws him right in. Well, the same way with this. When he starts talking about the seed and the sower, there are hundreds of people he's talking to that are going to fully understand what it is he's saying. Why? Because they've done that, or they're standing right there, or their family may be involved in that in one way or the other. So once the hearer is drawn in, he becomes vulnerable to the point of the parable, specifically intended point that Jesus makes. And then the message becomes more memorable. All right, so the last thing in regards to parables that we need to understand is interpreting. We need to interpret them properly. I'm so thankful that we have the explanation here. Jesus gives the explanation of the parable of the sower in chapter 13. I shudder to think what our so-called Bible scholars would come up with if we didn't have it. You take things like Revelation chapter 2 and 3, where we have the 7 churches of Asia, and they've gone and applied all kinds of different meanings to it. Things like 7 periods of church history and things like that, which has nothing to do with anything. They just come up with these things. So I shudder to think what somebody would do with parables if Jesus hadn't explained it to it. So what we need to understand when we interpret these parables is who was the target audience. Who's he talking to? Now that doesn't mean it doesn't apply to us. Oh, he was talking to a bunch of farmers. I'm not a farmer. That's not the case. You just need to understand who he's talking to and how then to interpret it. Identify the points of references. Is there like a Jewish lawyer involved? Is there a Pharisee, disciples? What's he doing? Is he condemning something or is he exhorting someone? Then there's all kinds of contextual clues. Why is he teaching it at this particular point and what's it about? Then also look at the parallel accounts. The Bible is its best commentary. A lot of times you can understand things just by going to the parallel account, which is why we're doing this chronological study of the life of Christ. And then look and see where's the lesson in this if it's not given to us. And then most of the parables will have an explanation. Now, I know that was basically, like I was saying, if you're watching Netflix or you're going to this new episode and you want to go back to the old episode, that's like fast forwarding through it real quick to get the points. I understand I went really fast on that. But I figured it was important to be able to just refresh our memory before we start studying the parables. That's what we're going to do for this quarter. We're going to go through the various parables and we're going to look at them and examine them deeper and help us to understand what Jesus is trying to teach us about the different concepts of heaven. So before we start in chapter 13 of Matthew in the parable of the sowers, anybody have any comments? I know I said a whole lot there in the last 30 minutes. To watch some of these series, you have to have a good remote. Well, you have to have a good remote, too, with the Bible, I suppose. You want to be able to back up, take your time, pause a second. Any other comments? Yes. Amen. There's one lesson. That's right. So to summarize what Jack said, if you didn't hear, is there is one lesson you should pull out of a parable. The second thing that he said was that there is two essential things that Jesus taught about, and that is the kingdom and about the Father. And I agree with that 100%. And I would, if I may, I would add the two other things that Jesus also taught about, principally the kingdom and the Father, but then he also taught about him being the Messiah, and he also taught about love, agape love. But the things that he needed to teach, mainly in parables, was the kingdom and about the Father. He's trying to help you understand these concepts that we don't know very well. Okay, so let's go to Matthew chapter 13. And let's read the parable of the sower, and let's see what we can learn from this parable after this quick review that we just did. So we just did the last season's show. Now we're going to go into the new episode. Here we go. So Matthew chapter 13. On the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea, and great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. Then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, Behold, a sower went out to sow, and he sowed some seed, fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places, where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up, because they had no depth of earth. And when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. And some fell among the thorns, and thorns sprang up and choked them. But others fell on good ground and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Okay, so if we start just with that, and you're standing on the shore and you hear Jesus say these things, remember the picture I showed you a moment ago of how you could look right down, there's a path and there's rocky ground. In fact, you could look across the sea even there, and on the other side see crops that are growing and all around you. Excuse me. So you would immediately identify with this, and especially in that day and age, most people were involved in agriculture. You probably sowed seed yourself. So you fully understood what was taking place, and you were able to immediately be drawn in and see what he's talking about. But just step back now and consider somebody like a Pharisee or whatever, and look at it from that point of view. Forget that you know that verse 11 and forward. Okay, I know that everybody has read this and knows what the sower is. We've heard sermons on it, but forget that you know all those things and just read what he says. Just this parable. A sower went out to sow. He sowed some seed by the wayside. So some of it, the stony places, it didn't grow. Others, it fell in thorns and got choked. And on some, it fell on good ground. What would be your reaction if you were a Pharisee? You weren't looking for truth. In fact, you were trying to catch him in some error or something, and all you heard him say was that. What would be your impression? Yeah, what a dumb farmer. Everybody knows you're not supposed to do that. That's a good point. Exactly. What difference does it make? So, okay, so you know how to throw seed. Big deal, right? That would be the Pharisees' point of view. It's like, yeah, everybody knows that. Everybody, who here doesn't know that if you throw seed everywhere that some of it's not going to grow? That's what I thought. So who is this guy? You understand where we're coming from here? Those who hear will hear. Those who don't hear are not going to hear. All they're hearing is just simply this guy saying the obvious. We have some commercials called that, right? Captain Obvious, you know. Because that's what it comes across.
One of the things, too, about that time is their teachers, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, leaders, what they mostly did was just repeat what other people had said.
Yes.
They were really good at just regurgitating what they had heard from somebody else and not coming up with their own illustrations. And they might come up with challenging questions, but it was mostly repetition.
That's exactly right. And they would, not only would they repeat those, but sometimes they would want to repeat something with somebody who had some sort of notoriety or some kind of credibility. So if I quote that, that makes me more important because I know this important person.
That's why at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, people marveled that he spoke with one kind of authority, not like the Pharisees who just repeated it.
Absolutely. Great point. Man, I'm going to miss having you here on Sunday morning, brother.
You're going to be
No, you always have good comments, and I appreciate it very much. So, fortunately, as we said, we do have the explanation of what this is. Imagine if we didn't. What would we be thinking ourselves? Well, what is he talking about? The same thing the disciples said, right? The disciples came and said, why do you speak to them in parables? In other words, we're not understanding what you're saying. And Jesus said to them, because it has been given to you to know the, listen to it, mysteries of the kingdom of heaven. But to them it has not been given. And so he's explaining right there, there's some hidden secrets in here that are wide out in the open that everybody can understand. You're just not using the right glasses. You're not dialing it in properly. So let me dial it in for you. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even that he will be taken away. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not hear, hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. So here he goes, and he quotes again what we said a minute ago about fulfilling prophecy. Jump down to verse 18. Therefore, hear the parable of the sower. In other words, let me explain it to you. Here's exactly what's going on. When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in the heart. So as soon as he says that, what does your mind start doing? It starts putting these things together. So what he said, when anyone hears the word, what's the word? It's the seed. You start realizing, okay, now I'm starting to see the seed. So whenever it hears the seed of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. So he's even using those words, that play on words. Sown seed, as in physical, to sow the word into one's heart. This is he who received the seed by the wayside. It starts clicking. These parables are so vivid in their imagery that it doesn't take but a second for these to click. But he who received the seed on the stony places, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. And your mind starts going, oh yeah, we use terms like that. Well, he's had a rough life. It's been a rocky time for him. Right? We use that type of terminology. But he who received the seed on stony places, hears the word, immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when the tribulation, just right here. We need to take this word out there. So the sower went out to sow. And that's the other thing we need to understand is we are supposed to just sow. It doesn't say that the sower went out and started inspecting the ground, going, well, that's a little too rocky there. That's a little too thorny there. That's a path. He wasn't inspecting the soil. How did he sow? How did the sower, what was that, Larry? He just, everywhere, right? Now, this is very common. You see the picture there. This is very common. They would just literally have after they tilled the ground as much as they could. Remember, we don't have modern technology nowadays. They plant seeds specifically, specific depths, everything. GPS prevents from a lot of waste and anything winding up on rocky ground. But back then, they didn't have that. They just take the seed and they just scattered it out. Now, if you're doing this and you're going around, some of it's going to fly and it might bounce or whatever and wind up in the path, wind up in the rocky ground, wind up in the thorns. Again, you're supposed to sow, not be a soil inspector, a seed sower. And so